A little over 48 hours into 2026, around 2 a.m. Caracas.
What the
Fireworks had lit up the night sky for New Year, but now the place illuminated by a series of never-before-seen US strikes on military bases and airports. Military helicopters, including Chinooks, a US Special Forces operation caught on camera phone. Their mission, capture the Venezuelan president Nicolás Maduro and his wife Celia Flores. Chances are the couple were inside one of these helicopters. The US was forcibly deposing a Latin American leader for the first time in this way in over a quarter of a century. Just hours before his capture, Maduro presented with a vase by a Chinese delegation at the presidential palace, Caracas.
Año nuevo, porcelana nueva. Año nuevo, vida nueva.
Not long after this, Maduro and his wife were being bundled into a helicopter by US Special Forces. They were brought to an American amphibious assault ship, the Iwo Jima, which was docked off the coast of Venezuela. Trump posted this picture of Maduro on board the vessel, blindfolded and handcuffed. As we speak, him and his wife are being brought to New York City, a journey that would typically take between 3 and 4 days by sea. Today, Donald Trump framed the operation in terms of U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere.
Thank you very much. Overwhelming American military power, air, land, and sea, was used to launch a spectacular assault. And it was an assault like people have not seen since World War II.
During the address, Trump made it clear that this was about more than deposing a leader. It was, in effect, an occupation.
So we are going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. And it has to be judicious because that's what we're all about.
Although he gave no clues as to what that would actually look like in reality. Although no one thought it would culminate in this way, Washington has been ratcheting up pressure on Maduro's regime for months now. Thus, the targeting of dozens of boats off the coast of Venezuela and the build-up of US warships. Trump has described him as the head of a narco-terrorist state, blamed him for enabling the industrial-scale movement of drugs and immigrants into the US. When Maduro and his wife arrive in New York, they'll face charges similar to an indictment opened against them in 2020 on corruption, drug trafficking, and other charges. But there's much more going on here also. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, and according to Trump today, the US is going to take over the country's oil business.
We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country.
Dawn over Caracas and the questions. What role will Venezuela's exiled opposition leaders now play here? What of Maduro's intact inner circle? And what does a US-run Venezuela actually look like?
So how is all this being viewed on the ground in Venezuela? Earlier, I spoke to Maria Corina Machado, who's a freelance journalist in Caracas. She told me when she first became aware her country had been attacked.
It was a couple of nerve-wracking minutes for many of us. We heard a loud noise, and geographically, Caracas is surrounded by mountains. So it was a hard noise that we can hear. And it was for several minutes, about 45 minutes.
And when you saw the announcement on Donald Trump's Truth Social account that Nicolás Maduro had been captured, how did you react to that?
It was something expected in a way, because the Trump administration began this campaign about 4 months ago, and the government was praising for something like that. Even Nicolás Maduro, he said that if something happened with him, the people of Venezuela should know how to behave, how to do, to go to the street to protect the sovereignty of the country.
How do people feel about what's unfolding?
It's history in the making. It's a story that continues to follow. We don't know exactly the situation. The next couple of hours will be important for the country because so far loyalists to Nicolás Maduro, they say they are in control of the country, but that could change.
And how would people feel about the opposition leader taking over? And there's a lot of speculation, obviously, about her whereabouts too.
There's no information if that is going to happen, actually, because the main opposition heads are outside of Venezuela. And right now, representatives of Nicolás Maduro say they are in control.
Is there much support for Donald Trump and what he's doing, despite the fact that it is an attack on a sovereign state?
When you ask people in the streets, they prefer not to say anything because they fear of reprisals from the Maduro government. It is a new situation, a different situation, an unprecedented situation for Venezuela. We haven't lived this in our entire history.
Well, let's get the latest from Kate Fisher, who's at the White House. Kate, what exactly is the American plan here?
Well, it's still pretty unclear. Donald Trump speaking to reporters just a few moments ago, and really there are still more questions than answers. He was asked that as his first question, and he suggested that the group of people behind him, which included Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, would be part of the group running Venezuela, along with people inside the country. He said that Marco Rubio had just come off the phone with the vice president of Venezuela, who Donald Trump said would do whatever the Americans wanted, which is interesting because she was also on state TV at the same time denouncing what the Americans had done. Donald Trump also said that he was not afraid of putting boots on the ground in Venezuela, although he suggested that the US presence will be largely to do with the oil reserves in the country and that American oil companies will be heading into the country as soon as possible to start running things there, and that the money they generate would pay for any of the US's actions there. He said, we are going to run this country, which of course is a very different statement from the one he ran his presidential campaign on, which was to remove the US from foreign wars and not to intervene abroad.
Well, there's been a lot of international outrage. Is any of this legal?
Well, if you read the indictment against Nicolás Maduro, his wife and others, it suggests that it says that Nicolás Maduro is the de facto but illegitimate ruler of Venezuela. And I think this is one of the ways the Trump administration is going to suggest that they have the legal authority to do that, because they say that Maduro was not the official head of state. And essentially this was a law enforcement, an arrest warrant for a drug trafficker, and not the removal of a head of state. And Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, said essentially just that. This was largely a law enforcement operation, and therefore we did not need congressional approval.
Kate, thanks very much. Well, joining me live now from Washington is Elliot Abrams. He was the US Special Representative for Venezuela and Iran during Donald Trump's first administration, and also held foreign policy positions under Presidents Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush. Elliot Abrams, how can kidnapping effectively a sovereign country's leader, no matter how deplorable that leader, and then running his country, be justified?
Well, he lost an election in a landslide last year. He is not, in the eyes of any democratic country, the legitimate leader of Venezuela. He is an indicted drug trafficker. So arresting an indicted drug trafficker is something that happens all the time. The fact that he called himself the president of Venezuela, I think, should not be of particular concern to us. I think the question of what happens now, as your reporter said, is the big one. I mean, what does it mean we are going to run Venezuela? I mean, the phrase doesn't even have any meaning.
Right.
I thought it was particularly unfortunate that the president said the administration had spoken to Maduro's vice president, but had not spoken to Maria Corina Machado, the Nobel Prize winner, who actually won that election last year with Edmundo Gonzalez. So all of that is pretty, to me, it's pretty disturbing.
Yeah, and disturbing because, you know, Donald Trump talks about watching this like a TV show. We know how this movie ends, don't we, when we look at what happened in Afghanistan, in Iraq. It's chaos, isn't it, that's coming?
No, I don't believe that. I think that's wrong. This is not the Middle East. Venezuela has a homogeneous population. There are no Sunnis and Shias and Kurds shooting each other. They are surrounded by democracies in the Western Hemisphere. So I think the analogies to Libya or Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan really have to be proved. And I don't think you're going to see that.
But you admit there isn't a plan, and you talked about the arrest of a leader. But I mean, it goes far beyond that. The fact that America is now in charge of this country, Venezuela. The US Constitution requires Congress to approve any act of war. That hasn't happened here. Is this illegal?
Look, some years ago, Barack Obama spent 2 months bombing Libya and claimed this was completely constitutional. Congress did nothing about it. So there is a long track record here, and it is bipartisan. And when I hear some people, particularly in the Democratic Party, saying, oh, this is so terrible, who were dead silent on Obama, that's just politics.
Yeah, but I mean, is what's really going on here that Donald Trump wants to get America's hands on some of the largest oil, well, the largest oil reserves in the world? He's already sending the US oil companies in there.
Well, Chevron, one of the largest, is already in there. This is a very strange thing because truthfully, we don't need that oil. They can produce maybe another 500,000 barrels a day, maybe 1 million barrels. The world oil market is 105 million barrels a day. So I expect that Venezuela will have very little impact on the world oil market or the price of petrol in the United States. It's very odd.
And you say that there is, you know, you're disturbed that there is no plan. How do you think the Trump administration is going to salvage this? And it says it's prepared to go in again with a second, much more devastating wave.
I think if they can salvage it, if they let the Venezuelan Democratic opposition that won the election in a landslide take over the government and lead the country as the people of Venezuela asked them to do by voting for them last year. If we try to substitute Americans, or worse yet, people from the Maduro regime, that will be a disaster.
But Trump says the people don't trust her.
That was a very bizarre remark. And I am asking myself, where did he get that information from? Who is talking to him? I don't have the answer.
And he seemed to have trouble remembering her name. But I mean, is the worry here that Venezuela is just the beginning? Because Trump says American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again. He's unleashed potentially a whole wave of instability across the region.
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think this is really a unique situation. There is no other country that, for example, is sending now it's 8 million migrants out of the country. There is no other country of importance that's involved with Iran, Cuba, Russia, China, the way Venezuela has been. So I do think this is going to prove to be unique. And I think most of what you've just quoted is just talk.
Yeah, but how does all this sit with a president who came to office promising to end wars?
I think we saw it in Iran. He can use force as he will, as long as Americans are not dying. This kind of intervention, which is over before he announces it, I think the American people will, in fact, support.
Elliot Abrams, thank you very much for joining us.